Welcome to Forum 360. Thank you for joining us on our global outlook with a local view. This is Leslie Unger, your host today. It used to be that every few years on Forum 360, we turned our attention to Israel, this country slightly smaller than New Jersey, the only democracy in the Middle East, a country that has given us Waze, voicemail, instant messaging, the defibrillator, and the phone chip. Since October 7th, we have turned our attention to this country more often. This country, fighting for its life both literally and in the world of public opinion. Our guest today knows Israel and the U.S. as only someone who has lived in both can know a country and its culture. Raised in this country, he went to Israel as what we call a lone soldier, an American who enlists in their defense force. One thing that makes him even more unusual is that he's a stand-up comedian and writer with stage and screen credits in 8 countries. He is the author of the comic memoir, The 188th Crybaby Brigade, about his year as a tank soldier in the Israeli army, and there's a story about a dog, and his newest book, Israel 201. From Texas, of all places, we welcome Joel Chasnoff to Forum 360. We welcome you.
Well, thank you. And that was a great intro, both about me, but more importantly about Israel. So
yeah, well, good.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. So I first want to kind of catch the audience up about your background, because I think your background in it is kind of fascinating. I've read somewhere along the line that you said that in school, when you were growing up, that you were one of the smaller kids and that you used humor to ward off the bullies. So how do you go from being a victim of bullies to joining one of the elite armies in the world?
Well, first of all, it's funny that you came across that story. It's mostly true. I wouldn't say bullies, but it's more that I was definitely the smallest one in school pretty much all through high school. And it's cliche, but humor was a way to sort of stand out a little bit and to, making jokes. I realized early on that when people laugh, it feels good to get that attention, and it's a way to connect with people. And I really, honestly, yeah, it's true. From even first and second grade on, humor has been a part of my life, and I just sort of decided to make a career of it. Why not?
Now, in your second book, Israel 201, you talk about, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but you do talk about a lot of the differences between Israeli culture and American culture, like even email and how different. So would you just say, let me just ask you now, are there more similarities in humor across cultures, or are there more differences?
Well, in terms of humor between Israel and, let's say, the U.S., I think it is very different on a few levels. First of all, Israelis are willing to get dark in their humor very quickly. In America, we have this saying, too soon. The idea being that if there's a tragedy, we really need to wait a long time before we make fun of it. But Israel, there's always pressure. There's always these tragedies happening, whether, God forbid, it's on a large scale, like October 7th, or even smaller terrorist attacks that don't get really spoken about in the media, but that happen all the time. It's a pressure cooker of a country. We're surrounded by enemies. And humor is a way to cope. And the way we cope is by making fun of our absurd circumstances. So that's one big difference. I think another is the audiences themselves. In America, often in a comedy club, the front row will be empty. People don't want to sit in the front row because they're afraid of being made fun of. But in Israel, people want to be up front. They love to be in the show. In general, Israel is a much more in-your-face, outspoken and aggressive culture that can be disarming to Americans who are visiting. But it's also a very honest culture. And in the comedy itself, that aggressiveness, that in-your-faceness, it comes across both on stage and in the audience, wanting to be a part of the show and being outspoken during the show itself. So those are two big differences between the humor there and here.
So one thing that you kind of allude to, we use the term here, read the room, right? Like you didn't read the room to mere mortals who are not comedians. But to know that difference, do you have any hints for people who are not professional comedians, but in reading a room?
Look, for comedy, reading a room is so vital. That's why there's no such thing as two shows that are ever the same. I've done literally, over 1,500 shows over the past 20 years, and every one is different because you need to take into account what the room is like. And that can be on a physical level, like what's the lighting? How is the seating? And it can also be an emotional level. What time of day is it? What's the weather outside? What news events might influence where people are at psychologically? So, what are the tips to reading the room? I mean, my first tip to anyone is just be as authentic as possible. And if there is an elephant in the room, you need to acknowledge it. I've been performing comedy since October 7th. Like the show has gone on.
Mhm.
And one thing I do is every show I acknowledge that it's okay to laugh. If it's a Jewish audience, I think they need reassuring that even though we're living through one of the most challenging times in Israeli history and even Jewish history, it's still okay to celebrate Israel and to laugh. It doesn't mean we're forgetting about the bad stuff. Once they get that permission and we've acknowledged it, it's much easier to do the show. But I think honesty, authenticity, and really connecting with the audience on a human level, that's what reading the room means to me.
And would that be the same to all audiences? Because I had a rabbi that once said to me, at every funeral there should be laughter and tears.
Hmm.
Would that be true of every, or is a Jewish audience different in some way?
Well, for me, a Jewish audience is different because when I'm doing a stand-up show for a Jewish audience, like it's much more personal. I'm telling my own story and I'm connecting with them on a very deep historical level and even psychologically in ways we don't acknowledge on the surface, but just the shared narrative bonds us. If I'm in a comedy club, it's much more about the jokes and making sure the jokes are in line with the mood in the room. But if it's a Jewish audience for Jewish comedians who really care about their identity, then it is deeper, and that's why it's different.
So take us back. You're your 20s because you went to Israel and joined the
I
IDF
wish.
after college, right?
Right.
So you graduate from college and you tell your parents, okay, I'm going to Israel and I'm joining the IDF.
Right. Every Jewish American parent's dream, by the way.
Their
that
dream. That's right.
Their college graduate, after all that tuition,
Now
is going to join an army in the Middle East.
the difference that people may or may not realize is that oftentimes young people go to Israel on birthright or something and they say, oh, I want to go back, but they don't really go back. So
It's true.
take us back there, and what prompted you to join the army and give it, 2-3 years of your life?
Right. Well, there were really two factors, and one of them is very serious. I think back to the first Gulf War. This must have been, 1991? And Scud missiles were falling on Ramat Gan and Israel. And I remember the Jewish community in America was praying for Israel and maybe sending money, but it didn't seem fair to me that we call Israel the Jewish homeland, but allow Israelis to pay for it in blood while we sit back in our comfortable homes. And I'm not trying to criticize anyone out there, but that's just my honest feeling at that age. And I still, feel a little bit now that that's happening. I feel there could be even more support from the Jewish community around the world for what's happening in Israel right now. So one was a very serious level. Like if this is the Jewish homeland and I consider it my homeland as well, then I need to fight for it the same way every Israeli does. But there was also the cool factor, being a teenager and going to Israel and seeing soldiers with guns. And it's not that
Uzis.
yeah, and
Right?
I'm not a military guy. And I'm pro gun control in general. So it's not the weapons that attracted me. It was the idea, I think, of, well, Jews can be strong. Jews don't have to hide who they are. They can defend themselves. That really appealed to me. And look, I won't lie. I also noticed how all the girls on my trip fell in love with the Israeli soldiers and had crushes
Yes.
on these hunks. And, there was part of that too. So I think it was a mix of wanting to be that cool Israeli soldier, but also really wanting to complete my Jewish identity and take the ultimate step, which is, yeah, to put your life on the line for something you believe in.
Now, can you tell our audience, for those that don't know, you were something called a lone soldier. That the
Hmm.
IDF actually has a name, kind of in a category for the lone soldier. So you became a lone soldier. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's actually a legal category. To become a lone soldier, you need to prove that neither of your parents are in Israel during your military service. And usually, traditionally, it's been volunteers like myself who come from overseas and serve, and their parents are back in their home countries. But it's also some Israelis, maybe their parents are diplomats and they're stationed in Europe at that time. And so that would be a lone soldier. And now we have a whole new category of lone soldiers, which are Israelis themselves who grow up in homes that are, let's say, less than ideal. Maybe the parents are abusive or alcoholic. The kids run away from home. They live on the streets. And then when they reach army age, the army actually takes them in. And it's not just good for the army to have them as soldiers, but it's a good way for these kids to acclimate into Israeli society and to have a future. When I was in the Army in the late 90s, there were a few hundred lone soldiers. Today, there are more than 7,000, and half of those are from overseas, but the other half, about 3,500, are Israelis. Many of them are LGBTQ. Some of them are from the ultra-Orthodox, what we call Haredi community, who
Mm-hmm.
normally don't serve, but they're
Mm-hmm.
choosing to serve, and their
Mm-hmm.
parents disown them. And so they are categorized as lone soldiers too. And as a lone soldier, you get a little bit extra pay from the Army. You get certain days off to go home and just take care of your bills and other errands that you don't have your parents around to do. So it's actually a legal term. In Hebrew, it's called Chayal Boded, which means lone soldier.
Now, in Israel, almost everyone goes to either the army or some kind of national service. So, with your kind of split experience in two cultures, do you see a value in the United States for 18-year-olds to have mandatory national service of some kind?
Oh, absolutely. Having been through the Army myself, I see it adds so much value to the personality of people, knowing that they are not just around for themselves, but they
Mm-hmm.
are part of a larger narrative and that they have to give something to a cause that is bigger than them, especially in today's world where we're in the generation of the I generation and it's all about me and the narcissism that comes from social
Is
media,
that
etc.
true also in Israel? Do you,
Well, look, social media certainly exists and people are into it, but even so, you still got to put everything aside and give your 2 or 3 years to this bigger project, which is maintaining the defense of the country. Or, like you said, national service for people who are conscientious objectors. They can do national service instead, volunteering in hospitals or orphanages or what have you. And this idea that you are contributing to a cause that's bigger than you, it's extremely healthy. And I think America would benefit very much if we were to implement that. But I also don't see it happening because America, I think, is really about your ability
mm-hmm.
to thrive and go as far as you can go, everyone else be damned. It's sort of against the American ethos, but I do think it would be healthy.
So let's flip that. Now, you
Sure.
have 4 children,
hmm
and so your children will all serve in the IDF.
Well, two of them already have
To our,
twins who are now out of the army, but they have.
so what is that like, for many Americans, they've not been alive when there was the draft. And so they did not grow up with the knowledge
Right.
from the time their child was born that they were going to be going to the army and putting their life in danger. So, what is it like as an Israeli? Everyone knows their children are all going to go to the army. Any thoughts on that?
Well, many thoughts on that. It changes everything from parenting to how kids think about their future. In terms of parenting, you all carry it in the back of your mind, even when the child is little. Like one day this child will
Mm-hmm.
go to the army. And so, on the one hand, kids in Israel, you might think if you saw them seem kind of undisciplined, like they run around a lot, and in restaurants they're might be sitting on the table or making a ruckus. Whereas in America, we'd say, quiet those kids down. In Israel, there's a little bit of less of that discipline. And I think one reason is Israeli parents, they know that their kids will get all the discipline they need at the age of 18 when they join the military. But also, I don't want to be too hard on my kids now. I want them to have a sweet childhood because later on they are going to have this difficult challenge called the IDF, Israel Defense Forces. It also affects how kids think about their future. America has become so college obsessed right now, which I think has gone way too far. And if in Israel, kids go to college, but we don't have that obsession with the test scores and the name of the college bumper sticker on your car because the army is standing there first. And kids want to get into the good units and they want to serve in the best place possible. But they think about their future differently. There's sort of life until the army, life in the army, and then what happens after. And most don't really start thinking seriously about what's after the army until they're already out. So typically they'll take at
And
least a year off
and until they're
before going to
out and
college.
have backpacked somewhere in the world, right?
Yeah, my kids backpacked in South America and for 7 months and they would meet Israelis everywhere. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the other thing that military service does. It binds Israelis to each other. There is a sense of community in Israel that we're all kind of on the same team and looking out for each other. And so when my kids traveled in South America, I wasn't worried at all because they were in these WhatsApp groups with other Israelis, and I knew that they had people watching their back. And I don't think you get that kind of sensibility everywhere else.
Today we are talking with our guest, Joel Chasnoff, who is a comedian, a stand-up comedian, author, and an American who entered the Israeli Defense Force and lives now in both the United States and in America. And in Israel. I want to get humor in and Israel and kind of our remaining time. What makes people laugh?
Oh, man. I could dissect it for you and get really scientific, and I promise it won't be funny at all. Look, there are ingredients, just like any good stew has ingredients, the element of surprise and the unexpected, but let's not underestimate the role of truth. At the end of the day, the truer it is, the funnier it will be. And this took me a while to learn as a comedian, because when you first start out, you're going for what you think is funny, but then once you get confident, you kind of relax into yourself and you're willing to be more vulnerable. And I think when it comes to comedy, there's sort of a rule that works for me, which is the most personal is also the most universal. So if I'm feeling it and it feels very private, there's a good chance that everyone else does relate to it too. And just being willing to say what others are afraid to say, I think that's a big part of comedy, especially now. Most politicians, their biggest fear is being made fun of on late night television shows, and with good reason, because the hosts of these shows, the comedians, they're willing to say the truth, whereas journalists or other figures might dance around the truth. Comedians go right for the truth, and I think if you're asking about what makes comedy work, being true, being authentic, is one of the the best rules to base your comedy on.
I find that very interesting as an executive coach. One of the things I do is write speeches for people, and I always say the test of any speech is that it has to be something only you could give.
No, so true.
And I didn't think about that in humor the same way, but authentic, I guess, is authentic in any kind of verbal communication.
Yeah, well, if you think back, anyone watching right now, think back to the comedians you love the most. There's very little chance that someone else could do their act. Even if you were to take those jokes and have someone else recite them, it just wouldn't be the same. And it's sort of this magical synergy between the physical look of the person and the words themselves and the body language. And you can't script that, but if you do it long enough, you don't have to. You sort of just melt into the fullest version of yourself when you're up there.
So I've always wondered if someone sees you in a restaurant or a Starbucks or something, like, do they ask you to say something funny?
Well, I'm not famous enough that people necessarily recognize me. I can drink my coffee in peace, for better or worse, in a Starbucks. But if it's people I know or people who find out I'm a comedian, yeah, I mean, if I'm on a plane and someone asks me what I do, I'll often just say I teach math because it shuts them up. That's not nearly as of a tinderbox. Once you say you're a comedian, it's, oh, say something funny. And most comedians are not always on. Even the comedians we think are always on. Like the late Robin Williams seemed like someone who was always on. But that's only because we saw him on television and public spaces. I know some people who did know him, and they said that he was extremely quiet and even a bit down and depressive. And so I think the offstage persona disappoints a lot of people when they meet a comedian because they expect us to be a certain way. And typically we're not.
When, my last question kind of on humor before we turn to Israel, when did you know that you could make a living as a comedian? Was there like a moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's the decision to try, and then there's the realization that I can actually make a living. And logistically, there was a moment when I was able to quit all the temp jobs and the tutoring jobs and all the other stuff I did on the side and that I had enough income to make a living. And it was a few years in. It was not right off the bat. And I think that's why a lot of people quit comedy, is because it's, first of all, there's no path. If you want to go to if you want to be a doctor, there's medical school and internships, and you sort of know the path. With comedy, you've got to figure out your own path, and you have to have a lot of faith that it's going to work out, even though you can't really see the light at the end of the tunnel. So it takes time, and you have to stick with it and be willing to do those temp jobs, which I did, but I think it made me stronger having done them. I don't resent it.
If I asked your kids two questions, what would they say? If I asked
they would say, yes, he's funny, but not around us. Yeah, what's the other question? No, I am funny around them, but it's different when you're at home. Yeah.
How do they answer the question when someone asks them what their father does? What do they say?
Oh, they say he's a comedian.
Because I mean, you do other
I
things
am.
because you're also an author, and you do other things. So I didn't know what they
Right.
picked out.
I think comedian is the foremost thing. It's
Okay.
also the most exciting thing. And they might get into the book writing and stuff. But yeah, comedian. It's cool to say your dad's a comic. Why not?
So you say that Hebrew is magic. Why?
Yeah. I have a whole newsletter, which I'll mention at the end, called Hebrew is Magic. And the reason it's called that, and I believe it, is because Hebrew is a beautiful language, and there's a lot of mystery and insight that's sort of hidden and disguised in the letters and words themselves if you just know where to look. So, whereas if you hear the word disappointment in English, it doesn't really mean anything to you. The word for disappointment in Hebrew is hitachzevut, and it's based on the root word kazav, which means to lie. And if you look further, what you're really learning from this is that Hebrew is telling us disappointment happens because we are lying to ourselves. And when you think about it, that's really true. That's why we're disappointed. We told ourselves something would happen, and we weren't sure it would happen, and now we're feeling the effects of it. So if you dissect the words in Hebrew, you can learn these beautiful life lessons about human nature and how people think, and it can actually make you happier, I believe. So that's why I call Hebrew magic.
Okay. Now, in your recent book, Israel 201, you talk about a concept that I found really interesting called splitting.
Yeah.
Would you talk about that?
You're referring to how Israelis cope with terrorist attacks. And
Yes. Yes.
yeah, so there's a psychological phenomenon not invented by Israelis, but it's just a known phenomenon among psychologists called splitting, where we sort of develop different personalities in order to deal with the circumstances on the ground. And we even develop little tricks and superstitions in order to make us feel safe. And that's what we're doing. We're splitting reality from the world in our heads. So during the 90s, when there were all these suicide bombings on buses in Israel, people would say, well, if I sit in a window seat in an even numbered row, then I'll be safe. And obviously, there's no science behind that, but we develop these methods to sort of coax ourselves into going about our daily lives. And the split is between the life we want to happen and what we are afraid will happen. So we need to create this dual reality just to exist in the world. And Israelis, more than anyone else, are always dealing with this.
Now, you also say that Israel is a land of contradiction.
Very much.
Now, you are coming to me from Texas, not far from Austin, and I just
Right.
wrote in my newsletter about Willie Nelson is kind of an example of contradictions. So,
Interesting.
Israel's a land of contradictions. Tell us some of the contradictions.
Well, one we talked about before, just the idea that kids graduate high school and 3 weeks later are putting on a uniform, getting an M16, and defending the country with their own lives for the next 3 years. It's a land where so many people are struggling to make ends meet economically. It's very difficult to live in Israel economically. It's expensive, taxes are high, we have national insurance, the defense budget is one of the highest percentage-wise of any in the world. And yet people manage to go on vacations and own cars, so they manage to live well. I think Israelis, more than working to live, Israelis, as opposed to living to work, they work to live. They know that there's still life to be had. And maybe it's because in the back of our minds, we know that we're always just one incident away from everything changing. So it's a progressive country where soldiers who are openly gay and lesbian can serve in the Israeli army. They have been since the early 90s, before the U.S. allowed such a thing. The IDF will help pay for transition surgery for soldiers who are trans and who have the appropriate medical approval. But it's also a Jewish country with very hardcore old school Jewish values. So you see these dualities everywhere you look in Israeli life. Sometimes it's annoying and it really makes it difficult to live there, but other times it's really uplifting and inspiring, and it feels very special. So that's another contradiction too, is that sometimes you just can't stand it, but sometimes you really love it.
What is one thing that would surprise people? Many people just think about Israel under attack in some way.
Of course they do.
What is one thing, in the remaining minutes that we have, what is one thing that would surprise Americans about Israel, about living in Israel?
I could give you many examples, but the one that jumps to mind is just how much coexistence there is between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. You would assume that Jews and Arabs absolutely hate each other and don't get along. However, the 22% of Israel's population is Arab. It's not Jewish. It's Arab Muslim, Christian, Druze, and we get along very well. Now, I'm not talking about Gaza or the West Bank. I'm talking about within Israel borders. 22% of the population is Arab, and we interact all the time and are friends and get along decently enough. You know, Hamas on October 7th urged the Arabs living in Israel to attack the Jews, and they didn't. And I think this is a sign of just how much coexistence there is, and I think a lot of people would be surprised to see that, because you certainly don't see it in the narratives on the news.
No, you don't. We've said before that in some ways the Mideast is very complicated, in other ways it's simple. You met one of Israel's citizens today, Joel Chasnoff, who's put a face on the challenges that we've seen on a daily basis. Joel, in a couple seconds, tell us how they can hear or read about you.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of stuff I can offer. I love sharing content about Israel and news, whether it's my newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, or Instagram, or whatever. But the one-stop shop for all of it, thanks for asking, is my website, which is just my name, joelchasnoff.com. So
that's
it. Go to joelchasnoff.com. You'll find everything you need.
Thank you for joining us on Forum 360 today.
Great time.
For your local outlook with a global view. Thank you.
Forum 360 is brought to you by John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Akron Community Foundation, Hudson Community Television, the Rubber City Radio Group, Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron, Blue Green, Electric Impulse Communications, and Forum 360 supporters.